Aloha, good evening. I'm so honored to be here. I am truly am honored to be here. And nui ko mahalo ya oko iko hele mayani ike ayahi. I am very grateful for you for coming this evening, and I'm very grateful to kuae ika aina hemolele oke ya aina nei. I'm very pleased to be on the sacred land where we are standing today. It's my honor to be on the homelands of the Muskogee Nation, in proximity to the Cherokee Nation, and close to the Osage Nation, and in a city where you are all working together and thinking about the past and how it can connect to a future. And especially to be speaking in the name of John Hope Franklin, ringing in the air, a man who brought mind and spirit together, a man who really understood what scholarship was all about, that it was about learning to understand the past, but to think about what that makes us do in the present in order to work for a better future. I can't aspire to all that. Well, I can aspire, but I won't achieve it. But we should always aspire to things we cannot always achieve. But today I will be speaking about the past, especially the past prior to 1907, because that was the task I was giving, and it's a good task to think about today. And I've got to set my watch so I know when I've spoken too long. Land acknowledgements are important tonight, and they are very important because we need to know where we are and from where we stand. And we stand today, or I stand today, on the lands of the Muskogee Creek Nation, sometimes also referred to as the Creek Nation, and I'll slip back and forth between those names, I'm sure. We need to know that, and yet it's complicated to do a land acknowledgement also. For one thing, a land acknowledgement can never be about just the past, just as history can never be about the past. If you name where you stand, then what is your responsibility to that place is what I always ask myself. And I always think that my land acknowledgements must always be about the future. If I live and work on the Dakota Nation's lands, which I do, what are my responsibilities? What does that mean? Also, but where we are is complicated because there's multiple ways of thinking about where we are. We are on Muskogee Nation land. We're also here in this beautiful hall of Cascia Hall Preparatory School, but we're also, and I think it's important today to think about, we are on the allotment land of Mrs. Nellie Riley Woodward, right? We want to be as specific as possible because that specificity is important. So let me try to think about Muskogee Creek Nation land and the allotment land of Mrs. Nellie Riley Woodward. Now, if you were to go to Google and you were going to say, Muskogee Creek Nation homelands, you're going to get something like this. This is important, right? So what you see that I outlined awkwardly in red is the homelands of the Muskogee Creek Nation, the Muskogee Nation in the southeastern United States. And you'll see that. And we're far away from there. And if you were to, and I'll explain a little bit of this, more about this, try to understand what it meant to talk about the allotment lands of Mrs. Nellie Woodward, well, you might get this. And here's a map that I prepared for us. On the right, you have a Google Maps that shows us with that blue dot exactly where we are located in the city of Tulsa. And on the left, you have from Hastains Township, plat map of the Muskogee Creek Nation, the allotment of Mrs. Nellie Woodward. Creek Roll 2213. So, how do we get from one to the other? How do we get from A to B? And what does that mean about land and how we acknowledge where we are? Let's go back to this first map. So this map is far away from where we are today, in a different state, but still within the United States. Once upon a time, this would have been a different nation. So please keep in mind that we're talking here about tribal nations, right? About American Indian nations, not just about reservations. And then if we come in here, let me just try to show you as we zoom in. So on the right-hand side, you have a Google map that's showing you the section of the city of Tulsa in which we are located. You can see running across the top the freeway. You can see 44 running down there. And then that blue dot is where we are sitting in this auditorium. On the left, you have 2 pages of Hastains plat map. Then let's zoom in on that a little bit, get a little bit closer, and you can start to see familiar landmarks, perhaps. But then let's go to that blue dot, to that section 18, and there we are. We're on Nellie Woodward's land. So how do we get from the southeast to this plot? And how do we get from an undifferentiated, united, contiguous Muskogee Creek nation to a little box of land, right? That's a question that's worth thinking about. And it's one that I'd like to think about with you this evening, if you'll be so patient. How do we get from the south to eastern Oklahoma to where we are today? Not physically, but historically, as a process of politics and power. How do we get from one to the other? Well, let's start here in the Muskogee Nation and the Cherokee Nation directly to its north. The Muskogee Nation being kind of the reddish, the rust brown there, it's number 2, and Cherokee Nation homelands being the 5, just north of there. These are their homelands in the south, right? In what we now call the Deep South. But there's also other native homelands involved as well. Here's a map of the homelands of the Osage Nation, right? And there's a line showing where the contemporary reservation is located. That contemporary reservation is just a fragment of the Osage homelands. You see that Osage homelands runs through much of the middle of the North American continent. Now, these lands were familiar, I hope, with the story of the quest and the hunger for the lands of the 5 nations, the Cherokee, the Muskogee, the Seminole, the Choctaw, and the Chickasaw in the American South. I'm going to talk a little bit about how Indian removal, beginning under President Andrew Jackson, led to the taking of their lands, their forced removal to the west into what is Oklahoma. But they were going to a place that was already somebody's lands. So there's a story of taking away land before we get to the story of the 5 tribes, and let's think about that. Here is a map that shows a series by which the Osage lands were taken away. You have it shaded to show how different treaties of different years cut away, down till you get to that purple bit in the middle. Now, those treaties lasted from 1808 to 1825. Isn't it coincidental that the Indian Removal Act that moved the 5 tribes, the Muskogee, the Cherokee, the Seminole, the Chickasaw, and Choctaw, came out, coming with the election of Andrew Jackson in 1830? Well, the way had been cleared from the point of view of the American government. They wanted to expand their ownership, their settlement, their agricultural development of what we now call the American South. It just so happened that they had treaties with existing nations in the American South. They wanted to move them. They needed to move them somewhere. So you shrink the Osage homelands. You create a place. Much of that place was Osage homelands. And so that cleared the way for the first step of the process where we're going to go from the great nation of the East to Oklahoma and then to Mrs. Woodward's lands. So what I'm talking about here is what we often call removal, and I think we really need to understand that as ethnic cleansing. Ethnic cleansing is the process by which a nation takes a population that it does not want, that it defines ethnically, racially, or perhaps in terms of caste, and it removes them. Ethnic cleansing today is a violation of international law, right? It is a violation of international law to forcibly remove people from their homelands in order to clear way for other population. That's an understanding of international law did not exist in the 1830s, but it was widely understood and denounced. There were many people who said this is immoral and this is unethical. That clearly included Native people, but it included also non-Native people, white Americans who said you really can't do this. They were not the most powerful voices, however. So in 1830, under Andrew Jackson would promise that he would make homelands in the South for white farmers to expand, to get themselves a piece of land so they could cash in on the cash crop of, some of it was tobacco, some of it was rice. It was especially cotton. So they could take the homelands of the Creeks, of the Choctaws, of the Cherokees, of the Seminoles, so on and so forth, and build up King Cotton. Okay? And as we know that with build King Cotton, we're also going to expand the grip of chattel slavery and the enslavement of African people on this continent. So the Indian Removal Act resulted in ethnic cleansing of people from the south towards the west, the lands cleared through the treaties with the Osage and some other people here in what is now the state of Oklahoma. Here you have a map that I'm assuming that many of you have seen versions of this map of the Trails of Tears. Not a single Trail of Tears, because here I'm speaking about 5 nations. So we need to talk about Trails of Tears. And that term, the Trails of Tears, captures the enormous trauma that came from the physical removal from the ancestral homelands to which people were related, from which they were born. These people who understand themselves to have emerged from these lands, the place where their ancestors lie, the spaces where the spirits live, to a new place. It was an emotional, it was a physical, it was a spiritual, it was an economic, it was a political trauma. The yellow arrows show the removal routes of the Muskogee Nation. The blue arrows to the north show the removal routes of the Cherokee Nation as they were pushed west to a place that would come to be known as Indian Territory. Now, it was terrible to lose those homelands, but at least there was a land of promise, to borrow the term from this series. And what were those promises? Those promises, when a nation speaks to a nation in a formal way, its promises, which are reciprocal, are referred to as treaties. Okay, that's what this is. And the land of promises reflects, among other things, the promises that the United States made in binding treaties when the 5 tribes agreed to move west. And it's going to be hard for you to read these because, it's a big room. The north is, to the top of the screen is an excerpt from the Treaty with the Creeks of 1833. To the south, to the bottom of the screen is an excerpt from the Treaty with the Cherokee of 1835. And just to read a brief excerpt that I highlighted there, with my poor eyes, it's going to be a little bit hard. They shall secure to the Cherokee Nation the right to their national councils to make and carry into effect all such laws that they shall deem necessary for the government and protection of the persons and property within their own country belonging to their people. Notice there's own country, so it's about land, right? Their own country belonging to their people. It's also about sovereignty, political jurisdiction, the right to make your own decisions in your own nation. So that's what the promise was. That's what the promise was. So despite that trauma, and we'll talk a little bit about that trauma, there was this promise. But the promise, in order to make it real, you need to understand what it meant to get reestablished on a new homeland. The peoples that I've been referring to, these are agricultural peoples. These are people who live by corn as a staple, other crops such as squash, right? That are also very important, and they live by the surplus of these farms on lands that are farmed communally, lands that belong in the social sense, but are farmed and are under the control of the women of the nations, of the villages that were the great farmers. So when you move an agricultural people to a totally new ecosystem of uncleared lands where they don't have the right seeds, the right crops, they don't know the rains, they don't know the seasons, it's going to be very hard. So the 1830s, 40s, 50s, 60s were a time of reestablishing and recreating a society. One of the things that they carried with them, and along with their languages, their spiritual beliefs, was the belief in the essential nature of a common ownership of the lands by all tribal citizens. All of the Muskogee Nation's lands belong to all the Muskogee citizens. All the Cherokee Nation's lands belong to all the Cherokee citizens. Now, I'm going to use a word sometimes today called land tenure. Land tenure is a way of referring to means of organizing who gets to hold land and why and how they get to use it. So all of the lands belonged in common to everyone. But And here in the United States, in contemporary, 2025, 2026, we're used to private land tenure, where a person or a business owns their land outright. That's what we're all used to. This is a different land tenure system. In the Muskogee Nation and in the Cherokee Nation, there was common land ownership, where everybody owned the land in common, but individual use rights. So that meant that you, as a Cherokee citizen on Cherokee land, could clear a plot, you could plant that plot, you could build your cabin next to it, and the produce of that land, that field would be yours. The land would continue to belong to everybody in common. If you abandoned that farm, if you abandoned that cabin, it would go back to the common property and other people could use it. But while you were using it, you had use rights to it, right? So it was a balanced system that was deeply important. It was socially and culturally embedded. It had also economic and social benefits. What it meant, for one thing, is that no one was truly landless because anyone could use land, could own their home. And especially, they could make a living by making a field and raising a crop or raising livestock. So I want you to see how very different this is from U.S. American society as it was planted, where the whole reason that Andrew Jackson, one of the reasons he wanted to take away the lands of the Five Nations was because there were so many Americans, white Americans, who said, we deserve land, we want to own land. He said, well, I'll get you some more land, I'll take it away from those Indians down south, right? Okay, so this is a different system, and it had advantages, it had disadvantages, but one of the important things was it avoided absolute landlessness and impoverishment. So what emerged was a nation, were nations of mostly small farmers with some large plantations and ranches. I'll talk to you just a little bit about that in a minute. But the great majority of the population living as small farmers. So just some visual imagery here on the left. You have a Muskogee farm home. It's a photo that was taken in 1901, but that house had clearly been built a couple decades earlier. And then on the left and on the right, you have a Cherokee woman working in her cornfield. All right, so this is when you travel the roads of Oklahoma and rural Oklahoma and you want to imagine the past, try to imagine this, right? A home, a small home built by hand on a plot of land that people, because they had built it and they were taking care of it, would continue to have the right to use. A garden that a woman is farming in order to feed her family, that she, because she was taking care of it, would continue to have the right to use and from which she could continue to feed her family. Now, this is not a perfect world. There is no perfect world, right? One of the things that we can point to and must be understood is that a minority of Muskogee citizens and a minority of Cherokee citizens practiced enslavement before the Civil War. They enslaved people of African descent. And they were doing so as they were modeling this minority of Cherokee citizens, of Muskogee citizens, as they modeled their lives, their families, their economic practices, their culture after that of their white neighbors, okay? Because they were being told that is superior. So they practiced this in this way. There were also free Cherokee and Muskogee citizens of African descent before the Civil War. So you have enslaved people of African descent, you have free people of African descent, and then you have many people who are of indigenous descent and mixed indigenous and European descent. These are diverse nations. And so when we live in a diverse nation, right, and we know how complicated that is. We know how that creates political challenges for us. And I want us sometimes when we look at the Muskogee Nation or the Cherokee Nation, don't think of them as totally different from your lives, but think of it, those challenges that we face of racial politics, of hierarchy, of class, that existed too, because these are diverse nations. And they're a kind of modern nation. These are modern American Indian nations. That's what these are. So after the Civil War, so the Civil War was a disaster for this place where we are, this part of eastern Oklahoma, which you can call Indian Territory. Both of the nations I'm talking about here divided, with a northern faction that allied itself with the Union Army, and with the southern faction, which fought on the side of the Confederate Army. This is going to be devastating for both of these nations. And after the Civil War, the United States forced both nations to free the enslaved people and to accept them as citizens. It was a gradual and a contested and a complicated process. But perhaps at the end of it, about a sixth of the Muskogee citizenry, for example, was of African descent. So this created a politics of race and class in the decades after the Civil War, right? And again, I want us to see it as different, but not totally different from the United States kind of white citizenry, where the question of, do we have more in common because we're from one class, or the things that divide us, which is race, is that more important, right? That's going to be a very important kind of element in Indian nation politics. One of the things that I think it's really important to see that occurred was the emergence in the 1870s and the 1880s of an alliance between small farmers called traditionalists and free citizens of African descent, especially in the Muskogee Nation. So people who did not have African ancestry or were not known to, right? The people that we just call Muskogee Creeks, and people that often get called things like Black Creeks or freedmen or that sort of a thing. Despite the differences between them, a political alliance was born within Muskogee politics. And that political alliance was important, and it was based upon the reality that they had something in common, and that was equal access to the land. Any citizen could make a farm on the land. All the citizens owned the land in common. That is something that is different, that existed in the post-Civil War United States. It could not be more different than what existed in the post-Civil War United States, which is, if we all know, the struggle for African-American land ownership, the contestation over 40 acres and a mule, and let's talk about that 40 acres. That was at the center. And the denial of African Americans of the right to access to land other than by renting from a white landlord was a way that African American people were kept from aggregating wealth, power, stability, right, by keeping them dependent. So this is very, very different, and it's worth paying attention to. The coalition was built by hard work. It meant holding off outsiders like white squatters and railroad companies and outside ranchers and cowboys on cattle drives. Okay, just a little thing about cowboy movies. Okay, cowboy movies, there's some guys, and they're going to drive some cattle from X to Y. Half the time you don't really know where they're going and why they're going there, but they are doing that. And then all of a sudden some Indians attack them out of nowhere for no apparent reason. And then, those Indians are just terrible. And then they chase them away, and they survive. And then all of a sudden, there's a pretty girl out of nowhere, and I don't know. Okay, so but let me try to explain cattle drives a little bit about the meaning of a cattle drive. This is the Muskogee Nation, or this is the Cherokee Nation, or it's the Choctaw Nation, or it's the Chickasaw Nation, or it's the Seminole Nation. And south of here, there's Texas. There's a cattle industry that's starting to grow. North of here, there's rail lines that are going through South Kansas. You got those cattle, you got to get them on the train. You got to get that train. It's going off to Chicago. They're going to slaughter those cattle. They're going to pack it up, and they're going to sell it. What's in the middle? Indian territory. So what do? You pay a bunch of probably Civil War vets, some of them African American, some of them white, some of them Mexican, to drive them out of Texas up to Kansas, straight through the homelands of an agricultural people. And those cattle are going through their fields, eating up their corn, messing everything up. So we're not talking a bunch of senseless native people attacking for no reason. This is not savagery. This is defending your territory from people that are coming through and destroying your rangeland, destroying your fields, okay? So just a little obsession. I just had to explain to you, cowboy movies get it all wrong. But it helps you to understand, again, how standing up for yourself, standing up for your nation was a very important thing in Indian territory in the late 19th century. So this was difficult work, and the difficult work of creating a political coalition, those of you who've been involved in politics and grassroots politics just know just how hard political coalitions across racial lines are. Well, they were no easier then, okay? So when you do that, and you do it successfully, that's incredible achievement, where you have people with different cultural orientations, different classes, and different races coming together. And when you have used that to defend something good, to defend that you are a common nation and you have access to land, you may not be best friends with everybody, but everybody has a right to that land and can farm it. It's special because you worked hard for it, and you're going to push back hard when someone wants to take that away. And people did want to take it away. White Americans wanted to take it away because by 1880, just 15 years after the end of the Civil War, Indian Territory is surrounded by white settler populations. Texas, Arkansas, Missouri, Kansas, they're full of farmers. Not all of them are getting the land that they want. Some of them want more land. They hear there's wonderful land, Indian Territory. And it turns out that in eastern part of what we now call Oklahoma, Indian Territory, you have nice green country. You have good rivers. It's very promising land, and people want that land. And who's farming that land? Who's using it? Nobody who counts in their opinion. Okay? Nobody who counts in their opinion. Just a bunch of, excuse the phrase, but in their mind, just a bunch of Indians. All right? So it's not being used properly in their minds. So to be properly, it has to be taken away. So the Indian Territory, that is the Cherokee, the Muskogee, the Seminole, the Choctaw, the Chickasaw nations, look to these white Americans, policymakers, congressmen, senators, the president, like a quote-unquote anomaly. It looks strange. It's not an anomaly. It's a continuation of native land tenure traditions that go back millennia. The United States is an anomaly on North America, not native nations. The United States is the anomaly, not the Indian nations. So, even though they had promised the land and sovereign governmental status, remember that Cherokee Treaty? For as long as the grass grows and the rivers flow, there's white pressure for nations of Indian Territory to undergo a process called allotment. It's a word that many of you have heard and most of you know, but let's just review exactly what it is. What is allotment? Allot means carving up the shared property of the tribal nation and assigning a plot to individuals. That's what it means. It means cutting it up into lots. Ooh, there you go. And they tore it into lots. Yes, they did. Okay. Approximately, so these were things, almost nobody in the Indian nations wanted allotment. They specifically did not want allotment. For different reasons, they didn't want allotment, but they did not. But they ultimately were forced to accept it. I think I'm missing a slide here, so I'm just going to say it. So what happened is in 1887, the United States passed a legislation called the Dawes Act, also called the General Allotment Act, which applied to almost all Indian reservations, which empowered the president to negotiate treaties where reservations would be cut up. The 5 nations that we've been talking about had a lot of political sophistication. They had lobbyists, they worked hard, and they got themselves exempted from that, and they held it off as long as possible. But in 1898, finally, Washington just rammed it down their throat with something called the Curtis Act of 1898, which fundamentally forced them to give up their communal ownership of land and their political sovereignty. You can't separate one from the other. And what did they get? About 110 acres per person in the Cherokee Nation. It depended on the value of the land, and 160 acres per person in the Muskogee Nation. Why did people resist allotment? Partly it's cultural. These are Indian nations, and many people disagreed with the very notion that this is how things should work. Partly it's practical. Private ownership is less secure than shared ownership. What we own together, you can't take away from me, but what I own all by myself can easily be taken from me. What is individually owned can be individually lost. Solidarity is safe. Individuality is dangerous. Political, it's not just about land, it's also about the political sovereignty. A prime goal was to do away with Indian nations, as governments independent of the American government or any state government. It's practical and it's political. What happens with quote-unquote surplus lands? When you divide up the reservation and then everybody's got their plot and then there's a little bit left over, oh, well, very conveniently that becomes a lot of, it goes to a white settler. Because this is also about transforming the population, because settlers overwhelm very quickly the native population, the citizen population, native, African descent, mixed, quickly non-native settlers overwhelm the population, leading to a loss of national independence. Okay, here's where I had the acts. I already described the Dawes General Allotment Act and the Curtis Act, so we can keep working. So that's what happened. The loss of land, the imposition of the state of Oklahoma on the Indian nations, culminating in 1907, and then the rapid loss of land, which I'm not going to trace here because you have more special speakers coming in the future, but you can see it all around you. It's in the land of the farms around you. That's all allotment land. It's probably the house you live in. That's on allotment land. The business where you work, that's on allotment land. The school you attend, that's on allotment land. Just like this school is on allotment land. It's this land right here. In the aftermath of allotment, we're on the land that was lost by a woman, an individual person named Mrs. Millie Riley Woodward, who in her youth she owned, along with her people, an entire nation. She owned a nation with her fellow citizens. But in 1907, the sovereign Indian nations were suppressed, and Nellie Woodward's life changed. And yet Nellie Woodward did not go away. The native people remained in all their diversity, in all their complexity. We can learn a lot about Nellie Woodward because her history has been traced by something called PSIG, the Presbyterian School for Indian Girls, a project that is practiced under the leadership of Professor Kristen Ortel, who we are so lucky to have with us tonight, which traces the lives of the native girls who went to the Presbyterian Indian Girls School. And one of the students there traced Nellie Woodward's life. And here we have a picture of Mrs. Woodward sitting proudly back straight, surrounded to the left of her husband and surrounded behind her with family. The native people did not go, but the world that they had built was taken away from them and it was transformed. But they stayed in that transformed world. They stayed, and this is their state. So I know this from the PSIG project. There's the website. Under the directorship of Dr. Kristen Ortel. And the research on Lily Woodward specifically was done by Kiara or Cecilia Gutierrez, who graduated from TU with a BA in the class of 2024. And we wish her Godspeed as she goes forward. So that's how we got from A to B. Now, how we got from her getting that allotment to being Cassia Hall, or from an allotment to that being your home, that's a whole separate story. It takes later history in the 20th century to understand that. But that's how we get to the beginning of this. Now, very briefly, I hope that you're like, well, holy cow, if that's how it all is, how do I find out whose allotment my home is on? Well, what you got to do is first you got to figure out the legal description of your land, the section, the township, the range. Then you have to find that place on an allotment land. And then a good thing to start off with is if you live here in the Tulsa area, and I bet you do, find out by Googling around if you're living on the land of the Muskogee Creek Nation, the Cherokee Nation, or the Osage Nation. I'm going to give these links to the John Hope Franklin Center. They'll be on the website, but you're going to go to this website and you're going to put in your address and you're going to find out what township, section, and range address your house is in. Then you're going to go either to the Osage land maps or the Cherokee land maps or the Muskogee Creek land maps, and you're going to spend, it'll take you an hour, but you'll figure it out. And in the end, you're going to have a name. And then if you're lucky, you can find out about that person. And if you can't, at least it'll take this and it'll stop being abstract, this was Indian land, to knowing that this is personal. And this is personal. And when you start talking about these things in Oklahoma, it can get complex. It can get kind of confrontational pretty soon. But getting personal helps us to understand why that politics is so hard, even in a land of hope and a land of promise. Thank you for your patience tonight. It's been an honor to talk with you.